the trial lawyers really, really enjoyed cross-examining witnesses.
Yeah.
And I felt badly for every one of the even if they were lying, even if they clearly deserved that cross-examination, even if it was beneficial for our client. As another human being, I could not stomach making another human being feel that badly. And meanwhile, I'm looking at the trial lawyers going, yeah, I really got that person. It was great. That was their jazz. And for me, it just made me feel kind of sick.
Welcome to The Defense Never Rests with Morgan and Akins, your monthly dose of uncommon sense about all things legal and some that are not.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Defense Never Rests. I am your host, Megan Henry, and today I'm joined by MC Sungaila. And MC she's a practicing attorney. She's a podcast host. She has a publishing company. Amazing. Like, she has amazing things going on. And, her and I got talking a few months ago and just were swapping stories about podcasts and our processes and what she's doing with her podcast and what I'm doing here. And I said, I just need to have you come on and talk about it. So here she is. So let's bring her in. Well, good morning to you and good afternoon to me, MC. Thank you for joining me today on the Defense Never Rests. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy to have you on because not only are you a fellow practicing attorney, but you're also a podcaster. And when we got on the phone, I guess it was a few months ago, I feel like we talked for like an hour just about our podcasts and like our, how we approach them and our processes. And, it's just nice to kind of talk shop sometimes with other people who are doing similar things than I am.
Yeah, it is really nice. I think that's one of the really great benefits of podcasting as well, which is the community that is created by it, both by the guests who come on and the community that comes from that, and then also the podcaster community of all of us supporting each other and answering questions and things like that. So it's really an unexpected blessing, I think, from doing it, because it's a lot of work to do. I know you have really kicked it up to a great level, so it's a lot of work to do it right.
Yeah, but it's also really interesting because when you talk to everyone's content is so different, and everyone approaches like the themes of their podcast different, but we all have very similar things to talk about because despite having a different topic areas, like some of the processes are very much the same. And so it's kind of nice to bounce ideas off of other people and pick their brain about how they do it versus how you do it. And even though your podcast is about appellate practice, and it's totally different from mine.
There's definitely, it's the whole production aspect. I think, like many things in life, if I had known exactly all the different components that went into doing this or other things, I might have said no in the beginning, but it's good not to know. So you just go ahead and, hopefully produce something, positive for the world. And, I agree with you. One of the things about podcasts that's really interesting is that they're highly personal and individual to the host, the creator, and then the participant in each episode. It's really uniquely calibrated in that way. I think even more so than it's different from, writing a book or something like that. There's still some overarching theme, but there's more, these are truly episodes and they can be different, a little bit different with person. And then your theme and your approach to podcast can evolve. I think you have to be comfortable with just going for it to begin with, not knowing everything and just starting and then adjusting as you go.
Yes. And it's a definite learning process too. and things have to always change. But before we dive into that, because I want to talk a little bit about you too, because I get a lot of attorneys. I talk to a lot of attorneys on the show. I talk to a lot of people in claims, and everyone has, different stories of how they got to where they are. And I find it as a real theme in claims. People in claims a lot talk about, like, I didn't plan to end up in claims. I just, ended up there. That common theme I have when I talk to attorneys is, well, I was, a X major and I didn't know what else to do. So I went to law school because I figured I could find a job that way. So I'm curious to hear what your story is and your path is, how you ended up, in the legal career and, how you approached going to law school.
Yeah, like how intentional was that?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's sort of two phases to the choice that I made. And the first phase was very young, probably when I was like 8 or 9. And I initially had the idea that I was going to be a writer, specifically a poet. And after I had that idea, the next thing that came to mind was a picture of me starving in a garret. And I thought, well, that's not good. You better do something that, can keep a roof over your head. This is a bad idea. Because I'd actually submitted poems to literary magazines and all this stuff. And I actually got, pretty far for that effort. But even when you're published, the poem, they're not paying you a lot for that poem. And it takes a lot to get to that point. So I thought, yeah, plan B, you need another plan. You can do this if you want, but you need something to put a roof over your head, because that's why I was always raised that way. You're not going to rely on somebody else. You're going to, plan on producing your own income and taking care of yourself. And so I actually thought about it for some time. All the adults who ask you when you're little, and they're just asking you for conversation, like, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would seriously answer that I was considering, I hadn't yet made the decision, but I would inform them when I had made the decision. They're like, kid, we were just making conversation. But eventually I came up with lawyer. I wanted to be a lawyer. I have no idea where it came out of nowhere, but I didn't think about the writing and the lawyering fitting together, but that's what I decided. I didn't know a lawyer. No one in my family, at least who was alive, had been a lawyer. So it was weird, but that's what I came up with. And then later on, only after I'd been through law school and after I'd had an appellate clerkship and been in practice for several years in litigation, was when I realized that I really was best suited, like my highest and best use was as an appellate lawyer. And saw that there was actually a practice, that you could do that in. And it came out of a really challenging time, kind of a scary time. I was relatively new as an associate, a 4th-year associate. I'd had 2 federal judicial clerkships, but then I've been in practice for 2.5 years in between those. And I was in a trial. This is like amazing, right? You're like 4 or 5 years out and you're in a trial at a big law firm. It almost never happens. So I'm in trial with all these wonderful trial lawyers, and I'm not getting the jazz. Like, okay, we're working 300 or 400 hours a month. Sure, okay, but I need a payoff. Like, I'm not really seeing the payoff. This is not good. And then the thing that sealed the deal for me that said, you need to find a different way, is that the trial lawyers really, really enjoyed cross-examining witnesses. Yeah. And I felt badly for every one of them, even if they were lying, even if they clearly deserved that cross-examination, even if it was beneficial for our client. As another human being, I could not stomach making another human being feel that badly. And meanwhile, I'm looking at the trial lawyers going, yeah, I really got that person. It was great. That was their jazz. And for me, it just made me feel kind of sick. And I thought, well, this is not good, because this isn't just like, hey, I might not have the skills. This is like, I'm a giraffe, and they're a lion, like totally different animals, and we should be doing very different things. And when you've decided like, oh, I'm going to be a litigator, and you realize, no, you're not, that's not you. What the heck do you do next? I didn't know that there were appellate lawyers. I did know that I liked doing jury instructions, writing the motions, talking to the judge in hearings, but I decided that probably that's not what trial lawyers are hired for. They're hired to do the trial. So if I could just get hired for that part of the deal, I would really enjoy it. And it turned out that by choosing appellate law, that's exactly what I do.
Yeah.
So if I'm in the trial court of working on major motions, working on strategy, either behind the scenes or actually arguing things to the trial court, and then of course writing on appeal. So it turned out that it was like the perfect fit of my original desire to be a writer, writing for which I now get paid, writing to persuade, and then this idea of like my my personality, my, my makeup. It was a much better fit.
Well, but also that the trial experience, though, probably really, especially early on when you took on the appellate practice, aided that because you had an understanding of how, a trial works and all the pieces to put in the pie. Because I think if you didn't have that, the appellate side gets a little bit harder because you need to have an understanding of how the cookies kind of crumble down the road in order to be able to build up your argument and really, persuade the appellate court, don't you think?
Well, I think it's definitely I have a lot more empathy for what's going on when I'm on the team with everyone. I have a lot more empathy and understanding of the goals that the trial lawyers have, which we share, which is we'd much rather win than not in the trial court. And if there's an appeal, we'd rather be the respondent or appellee. So we're thoroughly united in that plan. But there are also, I think, for appellate lawyers who haven't had the trial or litigation experience, it's a lot more pie in the sky theoretical. So they will say things like, oh, to preserve this, you need to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're like, well, yes, in a perfect world, yes. But I understand the reasons why you might not want to do certain of those things. Maybe there's certain things that you might upset the judge, or just different things that you want to think about as the trial lawyer, but you still want to preserve. So you make trade-offs. You say, yeah, this is the perfect way, but just doing this will be enough. Or if you're worried about telling the judge something because they're, a little short-tempered today or something, you can file something, but you still need to make it clear on the record that this was your position.
Yeah.
I think there's that empathy that comes from, I understand the melee that you're in, and we need to balance the trial and appellate venues in making these decisions. And so I can be a little bit cooler about like, yeah, okay, this is perfect, but the world is not perfect. So let's do what we can in the right way that kind of balances both the interest in winning a trial and then also preserving things for appeal. So I do think that makes a difference. And also, not only having done the litigation, but I clerked for a federal district judge and I clerked for a federal appellate judge. So I've also seen how, the sausage is viewed and decided, and how the different motions are reviewed, and how the perception of trials, both as they're ongoing and afterwards. So I think all of that really kind of informs the trial consult.
So one thing I'm curious about, because everyone has a different process and how they approach writing. And I'm curious, since, it is all of you, pretty much all you do, what is your process for writing an appellate brief? Because my process is probably totally different. Mine is like spit everything on the page and then fix it later.
Approaches, right? We have a little bit more luxury of time, usually, a couple of weeks in drafting something, usually sometimes longer than that. But our first step always starts with reviewing the records. So reviewing the transcripts and everything that happened in the trial court that's relevant to the appeal, and putting that record together. So first we want to see that, because even if you sat through the trial with trial counsel, the appellate court isn't going to see that. So, you want to see, okay, how does it look on the cold, hard record? And what do we have here? And sometimes you can see things, themes that come through from reading the record that give you ideas for the brief too. And then I think there's an iteration back and forth between reading that record and doing legal research, and just going back and forth between that for a while, figuring out what are our best issues, what are some good flavor facts to apply to the brief, even if it isn't, discreetly its own legal issue. And then getting down to outlining, which to me really is just laying out all the headings, the proposed headings of the brief, from the statement of facts all the way through the legal argument. And that kind of helps organize and coalesce which issues we're going to do. And then I just start writing, the guts of the brief, either the statement of facts or the legal argument. The summary is of argument, or the introduction is almost always last.
Yeah. And, do you have, as a writer, sometimes you need to be in a certain zone. Do you have little things that you need to do so you were like in your writing zone so you can like really focus in on the task?
Yeah, so I think there's two different phases, the writing and the editing. Editing, I really like a little bit of noise in the background. So, going to a coffee shop with a little bit of like movement around and focusing and editing, that's really good. I like doing that. I actually get, the hard copy printed out and just edit by hand in a coffee shop usually, if it's not COVID. And then writing, drafting, I often have, now there's scientific evidence about this actually. I actually have a certain music, either it's a song or an album that I play over and over when I'm writing one particular brief or one particular sort of long-term project. And it becomes like the theme music for that brief. And then once you play the music, it just puts you back into the phase that you need to be in to draft. Like, oh, okay, now here I am, and I'm working on this. And it just kind of helps drop me into concentrating on that particular project. Because often, of course, we're dealing with many different things, even though I would like to be that I'm constantly drafting just one brief for days on end. That usually isn't the case. So you have to get back into it. And that's how I do it usually.
So first of all, I love that. But now I'm curious, give me an example. What is something you've been listening to recently during, one of your projects?
Oh my gosh.
You're like, oh crap, now I need to remember what I listened
to. Yeah, it really varies. I'll say the last few briefs, some Kanye West songs actually from his album from which one is it? It's called Donda, I think, but one of his more recent albums. And because he's so creative too, and it kind of comes through in the music, and it kind of makes you, be creative. And then also there's this will be a little bit out there, but there's a gentleman who used to be a DJ, and now he has his own music that he's created from spoken word, often from podcasts actually. His name is Akira the Dawn, and he has this whole kind of music called Meaning Wave. And he has sort of like meaningful, inspiring speeches or podcasts. So he'll have like Jocko Willink, saying like basically, discipline equals freedom, and David Goggins, and all of these different kinds of people with different messages in the song, and then he builds the music around them. And there's something about that, like if you're having a really good, having a really hard time, hearing Jocko tell you to just like, stay with it, get with it, and just, it's gonna hurt, but get through it. That can help sometimes.
I love that. And I think I just need to employ that idea. Like I kind of like that idea of, whatever it be, like have that set of music for me would be each like file. Be like, okay, well this is, and it helps focus you.
Yeah, exactly. Like associating with it so that your body and your mind just automatically goes into that. And also there's something about playing it over and over. Like I'll play the same song over and over. It'll be on like a repeat. People are like, does that? No, because it becomes like the coffee house background. Yeah.
And then later, do you like look back on it and be like, I don't know, I just have this thing in my mind, like someone asked you a question about something like, oh, well, that was the blah, blah, blah brief. And you might remember associated with whatever song you may have been listening to, or the, the issues in that particular matter.
I don't remember, like I'm in the mode, and then once I'm done, I'm like, it's gone. I'm like kind of on to the next. And sometimes I like certain jazz or something like that. I'll listen to that for a few different briefs at one point in time. But yeah.
So one thing I'm curious about, because I've done, a bunch of appellate briefs in my time, but usually or every time I've always been involved in the case leading up to that, and in it, like fully in it. Or like the partner, when I was an associate, the partner was in it, and I got pulled in to help with the brief, but I was involved in the case. But it seems like your role is different. Like you get involved later. And then sometimes you might get, I imagine you get cases that may not even be at your firm, and it gets to the appellate level and they send them to you. So, how is that process for you when you're not involved? Did you have maybe have a clearer view of it because you're not entangled in the web of the issues?
Yeah, so first, we can get involved at any point. Sometimes I could be, at a major motion stage at summary judgment or something like that prior to trial. But sometimes I don't get involved until, let's say, even through the appellate stage, like at the petition for review stage in the state Supreme Court, or at the certiorari stage in the US Supreme Court. And so a lot has happened before we come in at that point. So we have to be adaptable about coming in at any point, any point in the flow of the stream of the case. And just like your quick study as a litigator, I think our job is to be an even quicker study, because we have to get our arms around the case of where it's been. And then we have to get our arms around the law, because our job is to fit the case into the development of the law. And so we have to understand that. And then we have to understand the industry or the overall backdrop of the particular case itself. So there's sort of three buckets that we have to learn really quickly. So, I think you should have to be a really good quick study. And then the third part, which you mentioned, which is you like a certain amount of objectivity. There is, because you haven't already decided what the case is about. Like, as you work through as a litigator, you come up, this is our best theme, and here's what we're going to go with the witnesses. And we weren't part of that. So we can have a little bit of objectivity on that and say, is there another theme? Is there something else that we could look at? And then the second thing, which I think that most people don't really think about, but I've found to be true, both in the trial court and the appellate court, which is that trial lawyers look at cases by the facts. You're dealing with evidence and admissibility and how is this witness and credibility and all that kind of stuff. So your first instinct looking at a case is the facts. And then my first instinct is to look at the law, because that's what I do.
Yeah.
Because I'm not making facts, I'm just reviewing the facts that were put in the record. So sometimes in the trial court, I've found a really great partnership between trial lawyers and appellate lawyers, because each of us will look at it from our own perspective first. And then if there's a really thorny problem, let's say some piece of evidence that we'd really rather not have be admitted, but we want other evidence admitted, and we've got to think about why does that make sense? And it may not make sense as a factual matter or even an evidentiary code matter, but maybe on a broader legal theory, like the overarching substantive theory of the case, or some element that's developing in the law about that it does make sense. And so we can't find an avenue one way, but we can another way. And the only way we can do that is like putting our heads together and having our different immediate approaches sort of merge and figure out, okay, of these, what is the best way to go? So that's kind of unexpected, and I don't think that most people think of that, but the more teamwork and trial consulting you do, the more you can come up with that kind of, aha, we have it.
And it is true what you say about, I think litigators, we think about the laws, they're very much there, but we know how the facts can really juries hear facts more than they hear legal arguments. They go to sleep during the legal arguments, and especially anything complex, is hard to explain or to, express to a jury. But facts they get, and the simpler they are and less convoluted and complicated, sometimes the better. So, I do agree that we kind of get caught up in that. But are there times though that when you're reviewing the record, that on your review you're like, oh, I wish this were done this way, because it would have been such better support for the argument I need to make today?
Yeah, I think there's really, before there was an appellate specialty, shall we say, and you're an old school trial lawyer, you did both of those things.
Yeah.
You made sure, intuitively, that you were doing what you needed to do for the trial, but that just in case. You were also making your record, putting in evidence, proffering, things like that. And I see with some really great trial lawyers, especially more classically trained, who did all of the stuff, trial and appeals themselves, that every time I look in the record, I go, yep, there it is. I have what I need for this. And you also were thinking about me. Thank you so much. So here's what I need, to make an argument, whether it's about prejudice or the other kind of evidence we should put in, or a legal argument that I would like to see so that it doesn't look like I'm making an argument for the first time on appeal. We thought about this, we pressed it all the way through, we're serious about this point, we're not just having sour grapes. All of that, yes, I have many moments of, when I see the record. Yeah. But for those who weren't raised in that kind of training, it can be helpful to have an appellate lawyer kind of thinking about those things as they're going through trial.
And so what I kind of hear from that too is it would be helpful. Like you don't go into a trial expecting there to be appeal, or even you don't expect appellate issues to come up. You don't plan for that. You try to avoid them. But it sounds like it would be very helpful almost to work side by side with someone with the appellate knowledge in order to make sure that everything goes smoothly, should it not, I guess.
Yeah, or even for the other side. I mean, because you don't know, you're going through it and you're like, gosh, I hope it looks like we're going to win, but we don't know. And then if you do win, you want to win in a way that's not reversible.
Yes, right.
So,
through this process, you're full practicing appellate lawyer, but then you start your podcast, and can you talk me through the process of how you got there and why you decided to do that? Like what was the instigation for that?
Yeah, so I think there's really, actually, when I really think about it, there's really sort of two instigating factors to it. One of them is more, maybe a little more woo-woo. The other one is, a little more practical. So I'll start with the practical, I guess, then I'll move to the woo-woo. So the practical one was that I had noticed a couple years ago that at the appellate level for judges, there were not as many women judges just around the country as I would have hoped to see. I mean, there were, including state and federal courts, there were 150 women on appellate courts, whether it were intermediate, state Supreme Courts, U.S. Supreme Court, federal circuit courts. That seemed very low to me. And I wanted to kind of celebrate those who were on the courts and encourage others to apply, to think about that as an option. I mean, there are some courts where there were no women at all, or one woman for many years. So I had that idea, and my first idea was to do a book, and I had thought about doing these interviews in a book form. So I started work on that, and I found in the process that the judges really enjoyed just having conversations, and they would much prefer just having a podcast type conversation and be done with it, instead of having to work on, writing their essay and just working. It just took more of their time. And I thought, what is something more efficient that respects their time and would actually be more interesting too? Because I think lost in translation a little bit, if you didn't get to hear their actual conversation with me, it just didn't have that same intimacy that it does having the actual conversation. So I set that aside, but I had that vision, a few years ago. And then with COVID and podcasts coming out, and honestly, courts getting really comfortable with Zoom and being comfortable with this kind of medium, I thought maybe if they were willing to talk, maybe this would be a good medium for this. And an opportunity to reach people who aren't members of bar associations, who may not even be in law school or know that they might want to go to law school yet. So I thought it was a broader form of public education as well, for girls as well as young women. So that was kind of how it moved from book to podcast. And then I just asked a few judges I knew, kind of test it out, see if they wanted to do it. And they said yes. So, the podcast was born. And then I thought it would only be a few episodes, like maybe 15 episodes, something like that. But each of the guests would recommend somebody else to me at the end.
Yeah.
So I realized it had a life of its own, and it was clearly providing something to the guests, but also, I would get comments from people as well who enjoyed the episodes once they aired. So I thought, okay, this is doing a service both to the guests and to others. So I'll just keep going. So now I'm just like a shepherd. I'm just a shepherd. I'm just a conduit for something bigger, and we've done some really cool things with it. I think that, we can talk about this too, but I think that podcasting is just one of many things to add to the various things we can do to serve the community and to just, be out there outside our offices. I think they're not in competition. I think they're complementary. Bar association work, traditional panel speaking, and podcasts. And then the woo-woo part of how it came together is like, I don't know if I would have made the jump from book, obviously I'm much more comfortable with writing, to podcasting, which I knew nothing about, if I hadn't 2 years before had the same kind of leap of faith where I decided to start a publishing company and publish gift books and like inspirational gift books, basically, inspired from my mom, who really helped me through my career by sending me very encouraging notes, really pretty much every day in the office and, when things were tough. So I kind of had the feeling that I don't know what I'm doing, but I feel like this would have a positive impact on even a few people, and it's worth doing it. So I figured out how to do it. So I think that experience of just taking a leap into something I had no idea what I was doing helped me do it the next time to do a podcast.
So tell me a little bit more about that, though, because I didn't know that about you. So tell me about these notes. And then you said your mom wrote you these notes, and so tell me more.
Yeah, so every day she would send me, she would send in the mail when the snail mail was still quite prevalent, these notes to my law office and to my clerkship and just wherever I was working. And they would say mother's thoughts for the day across the stationery that she made just for this purpose. And then she would put some kind of, I saw this somewhere, here's a great quote, or here's a thought, just sort of encouraging, keep going, even if things are difficult, kind of quotes and comments. And literally it was like every day for years.
That's amazing.
So it was really neat. Yeah, it was really cool. And I realized looking back that if I, it's really hard, especially for women in firms, as you're looking around and going, I am 5 or 6 years out, I'm still at this law firm and I am the only woman, did I not get a memo? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
So it's challenging, I think, particularly for women. So I had that in mind when I thought, I think this had a lot more impact on me to just keep going each day. And maybe I can have that impact on somebody else by sharing, what she did for me. I'm only one daughter, but maybe we can help some others along the way.
Well, and I'm just amazed by her managing to do that at such a high frequency and so consistently.
It's really
very impressive.
Because she was working also. So she had a pretty demanding career also. So I'm amazed by it. I don't know that I could be that, consistent and positive. And I don't know if I could really do that the same way she did, but she was very committed to doing that. I think she recognized how helpful it was for me.
I can't consistently put notes in my kids' lunch. And now I'm feeling really bad about it. I'm like, your mom managed to put an envelope in the mail and to get a stamp. She had a stamp every day. And I can't think of what to write on a measly note to put in a lunchbox.
So, which is really funny that you said that, because I did one book and then everybody really liked that. So I did a second book. And then the feedback I got was that people were writing some of the quotes and things down on lunchbox notes for their kids because they said, well, we want to do this, but it's really hard and we can just do this, we can give some positive notes, but we'll use the book to do that. And they kept saying, like, we wish that we had something as pretty to do for our kids that was ours, that made it easy for us to do a similar kind of thing for our kids, for our grandkids, whatever. And so that caused me to make a journal. So there's a self-guided journal as well that's very pretty and has cool designs on some of the sayings, but also has guided prompts for you to do the same kind of thinking and writing for your child or grandchild as well.
Oh, well, I need to get some of this. I love it. And now I'm feeling like I need to fill this, like, I want to fill this void and start sending my kids inspirational. I'm buying your book. I'm going to copy it. Like I'm going to do what all those other people did. I'm like, man, yeah. All because your mom managed to get a letter in the mail, a note in the mail every single day with a stamp. Like if I had to mail something out myself, I'd have to find my Christmas card stamps, like I like those are the stamps I have. And they're probably with the Christmas cards from last year.
It's pretty amazing when I think about it now, actually, but she's not consistent. So that's been, just a really fun project. I mean, not, law related at all.
No.
So, figuring out how to do that and to publish that kind of, I think all of these things, like various creative things, something that takes you out of your comfort zone, just helps you grow in a lot of different ways. Even when I did have, I confessed to having sort of an early midlife crisis where I wondered whether I really should have been a poet. Like, oh my God, did you just do that because you were afraid of starving in a garret? And so I took writing classes, creative writing classes, short story writing, essay writing, all different kinds of things for a couple of years, both to discover whether is this what I really should be doing, but also just to kind of stretch my writing, not just legal writing, but thinking about the legal writing in a different way, as a different form of storytelling, and applying those same techniques to the law. So I think that everything that we do helps us grow a little bit and then helps us in our business or our practice as well.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask before I got sidetracked with the notes, because that's okay. Back to the podcast.
Yeah.
When you first started approaching some of these judges, did you get some hesitancy about coming on? Because I imagine like some judges might be very hesitant about being in, like, this is a more public forum and they're talking about what they're thinking about cases. And, and so I imagine that you get a little bit of like, oh, I don't know if I should do that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some people, and I think it requires two things. One is, if you're really shy and you're not interested in that, some appellate judges are a little more introverted, and that might surprise you. So they're not comfortable with that, that public of a statement, and that's fine. The other thing is how broadly they view civic education and public education about the judicial system. Mm-hmm. Some of them have a very broad view about that, and like me, see this as an opportunity to reach the public more generally about who they are and what they do. It's not just lawyers, and the fact that you can have a public education about the judicial system through this one person is a new avenue. It's just a new avenue to do that. And in fact, there are 3 state Supreme Court justices who have their own podcast called Lady Justice. Mm-hmm. And so Arkansas Supreme Court, West Virginia Supreme Court, and the Michigan Supreme Court. And they've collaborated on this podcast. It's a monthly podcast that started during COVID. And they see it the same way, that this is an opportunity to educate about state Supreme Courts and what we do, and also encourage women to join the bench. And when I was sort of wavering about whether I should do this podcast or let somebody else do this instead of me, I met one of the justices of an appellate judges conference, and I recognized her, because I'd listened to her podcast, and I said, hey, do you have any tips? Because I don't know what I'm doing. And she's like, yeah, sure, I'll give you any any tips you want, just procedurally, like how we do stuff, I'm happy to tell you. And you absolutely should do the podcast, and I'll be one of your first guests. And that's like how, yeah, so that's how that kind of happened. And she was one of the first episodes.
Well, first of all, I got to check out that podcast now too.
Oh, really good. They're continuing on with it. They're very committed to it because they see the same thing as, this is an opportunity to have a lot of civics education in a different format. And yeah, so that was sort of like that last little nudge if you were doubting it. And I was like, okay, well, she's agreed to do it, I better do it, and she can do this, so I certainly can. So I think that, there during the pandemic, because of the use of Zoom and all of this stuff, people had to get creative. Courts had to get creative about how they were doing their job, but also they had to be creative about outreach. And so I think that gave that. I don't think it could have happened, or there would have been openness to doing this if COVID hadn't happened and judges are more comfortable with Zoom. But no, I give full and complete credit, especially to the people, judges, lawyers, general counsel, law professors, legal tech founders, all the various array of people I ended up inviting on the podcast, but particularly the first 15 who did this before there was no podcast. Like most people want to say, oh, can I see your podcast before I come on? Because I want to see what to expect and the production values and sort of what it's all about. But no, these initial people bravely, courageously believed that whatever I was going to do was going to be okay. And so they said, yes, we'll do it. We'll kind of jump into the ocean with you and see what happens. So I give them a lot of credit. There would be no podcast without people who are willing to kind of take that leap and move forward.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way. Like at the beginning, when I would approach people about coming on, and I just had to first be okay with rejection, and or just silence, which is sometimes you get that too. But then I really appreciate those who, when it was very new and not established at all, then the willingness to take the time out of their busy day and sit down with me for an hour and a half, and, chat. And, and I still appreciate any guest who comes on and wants to sit down with me, but especially at the beginning when, at least for me too, I was still like kind of finding my way as to, how I wanted this to look. And some of them were kind of like guinea pigs,
Yeah, it's kind of like it's a particularly special leap of faith. It's like, it's like a startup and you have these initial investors, in your project, and that level of belief in you and like that this could be something positive was really motivating.
So, take me through your process though with, planning out, your guests and your episodes and stuff. How do you work through it?
I think it's fairly intuitive. It's a fairly intuitive process to me about kind of what feels like the next, interesting place to go.
Mm-hmm.
I already started with my initial mission of appellate judges and focusing on them as guests, as many of those judges as willing to be on the podcast. I always say yes to them, and that's a priority. But I also, as often happens with podcasts, they sort of morph and grow, and you also adjust to the medium. So one of the things that's different between a book and a podcast is you have this idea and theme for the book, and you've got to follow that through all the way. But here it can adjust as you listen to different guests, as you figure out, as you get feedback from listeners, as you realize that there might be other purposes that the podcast could fulfill. And so I moved pretty quickly from appellate judges to trial judges, because I started thinking, okay, if you're wondering about different avenues of what you could pursue with your law degree or your legal training, or even on the bench, well, you'd want to know about all different kinds of judges and women in those roles to highlight them and showcase them, and also that women are already kind of, kicking butt in that area, and you can join them if you like. And then I started thinking all the other ways, all the other roles that women are playing: managing partners of law firms, trial lawyers, deal lawyers, general counsel, and then moving outside that to entrepreneurs, to nonprofit work, whether it's legal nonprofits or running museums, writers, things like that. Just kind of kept moving out in concentric circles. And so I keep thinking about that. So when I'm thinking about guests, I think about, have I had somebody who has done this kind of work in this exact way before? If I haven't, then I might want to have someone in that area to expand so that you can think as a law student more broadly. I also think of it as, if you're wondering, even not thinking about law school, if you're much earlier in the process, then seeing all of these ways that you can implement the law degree may cause you to go to law school, because you're thinking, oh, going to law school means I do X and I don't want to do X. But like I found further on, there's so many ways, even within law, practicing law, to be a lawyer, that if one thing isn't a good fit, there are certainly others that might be a better fit. So I also think about that too. Just think about am I displaying the broadest perspective on what, people are doing.
And also it's just providing, permission that to the people listening or considering going to law school or in law school, or that it's okay to pivot. And, you may have gone into law school like, I want to be a litigator, I want to do M&A, I want to do commercial real estate, whatever it may be. And then realize when you're there, or your first job, I don't know if this is and it's okay to pivot and utilize that, what you know, in a different way that works better for you. I mean, you're a prime example of it, like you were in litigation and you're like, you know what? I don't know if this is where I need to be. And then you found a perfect place, and now you're able to use all your creativity and kind of fill all your buckets.
Right.
And so it's good to give people, allowance to pivot and, listen to.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody, everyone who's on the podcast, whatever their position is now, obviously they have many different positions prior to that. So you can see kind of the meandering stream that careers tend to be, it's not completely linear. And many people, even those on state Supreme Courts, will say, I never imagined I would be here, but this is, this is where things led. So I followed it. So I think, permission to change course and to do things you hadn't considered to begin with. That's definitely.
I would say, I think from like my classmates, my law school classmates, there are only a few that are doing now what they said they wanted to do at the beginning of law school. Myself very much included. I'm totally different from where I thought I wanted to be. And I think because we don't know, and you don't know until you try, and and then you also, it depends on the market, what jobs are available there at the time too. That could
exactly. There's a lot of practicalities to things also. The other thing that I find really interesting, I mean, there's certainly oral histories that are done, in certain settings, whether they're just within certain courts. It's not as widespread as this. So I'm working with judges and lawyers from all over the country. So there's much more fluid aspect to all of those stories that you might not otherwise have in another setting, which would be more geographically bound. And then also what's interesting is I have guests who are graduates of law schools, let's say in the late 1970s or early 1980s, as opposed to, through the 1990s or even 2000s. And the experiences, I mean, their individual experiences are certainly their own, but you can see from their stories, because there's coming to be enough of them, that there were very common threads, and that being a woman in law school in the late 1970s is radically different than being in law school in the 1990s. In particularly in the 1980s, there were massive changes for women in law schools, their presence, the jobs that were open to them after law school, you just think first how relatively recent many of these changes were, and how many more opportunities women have now coming out of law school. And so it's really like a very visceral, you can read about history, but you're like, no, I'm listening to these stories. And these people are here, still practicing or on the bench. And they are telling me that, only men could apply to certain jobs, and people were unafraid about writing that down in their ads. And now that, no way. So I think there's a message too from people who, particularly those trailblazers who started and were the first at many things that they did, graduating in the 1970s and 80s, that many of them really excelled. It became Supreme Court justices, became general counsel, became so many things. And look at the obstacles they had at the very beginning of their career. We don't have those same obstacles. Like, how much more can we accomplish and move the ball forward when we don't have that early on? So it's kind of, I hope, inspiring in that way as well. It's possible. The change is possible. Major change has certainly happened in some lifetimes.
Yeah, and I do think we have a ways to go, but we've come a long way as well. Like my experience was vastly different from my first mentor's experience. And I'm thankful for that. But I still experienced some there was times that I was like, I was the only female trial attorney in my my office, and there were issues with that. And even I remember, I think I've talked about this on this podcast before, like when I was pregnant with my older daughter, like how long I waited to tell anybody, because I was worried about how it would impact my job. And I think I'm hopeful that some of that has changed, but I don't think it's totally changed. Like I've heard plenty of people who wait and wait and wait until like it's clearly obvious.
Right.
But you're worried like, oh, I suddenly won't get the cases anymore. I suddenly, I'm suddenly going to be worried I'm not going to come back to work, or all of the things. And I think we still have some work to do there.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true, but I hope that by honoring and celebrating the progress that has been made, that you can have a little more, optimism about the rest of things going forward. For me, I hadn't realized how significant a change it was between, I started law school in the late 1980s and graduated in 91. And I realized that just by timing of my coming into this world, that I really, by such a hair, avoided and did not experience a lot of the more, in your face kind of situations that the women graduating in the early 1980s had. Even I didn't realize like how by such a hair that I didn't experience that. Now, it's not to say it didn't happen later, when many of us have had, but it wasn't at the entry stage, and it certainly wasn't the first few years, which was, a blessing.
So, and have you had, from since the time that you launched your podcast, and have you had any listeners reach out to you and like, talk about like how it's impacted, the episodes have impacted them?
Yes, I have. It's really nice. It's nice to get the personal notes, but it's also nice to, just come across comments, like people tweeting things out or posting on LinkedIn or someone like, oh, I didn't even know that person. And, they're saying something good about this episode or recommending it to people. So it's kind of neat to get that. But for me, both the more deep and sort of personal impacts that things have, the more it's more valuable to me. So it's nice that, there's the broader public conversation that's going on about the podcast, which actually was just named in like the top 20 women in the law podcasts globally.
Really? Oh, amazing.
So yeah. So, and it just launched in February, so I'm very excited. So I want to reach out to like all my other, everybody else who's on that list and talk to them about their podcast too. But so that's gratifying, but I think more than that is the personal notes that I get from people, whether they're saying that it helped, one particular lesson helped them with a difficult situation, or in a couple cases, I've had things where people have said it's inspired them or connected them. They heard an episode with a particular guest, they connected with that guest, who then inspired them or helped them or gave them the tools to, establish a nonprofit, to do something that was helpful in the world. And I value those kind of notes and comments much more than the other stuff is nice, but that's kind of why I do this stuff, is I hope that I have an impact on people, and I believe that individuals make a difference in this world. So if we can make a significant difference, a meaningful difference for even a few people, then you can have a role in helping, make the world a better place.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of feeling I have when I get nice personal notes about my mom's books and things like that, where they're really deeply touched and their family is impacted, in a very positive way, in a difficult time from those books. That's what I hope to achieve.
Well, you're a ripple maker. You start the ripples. And
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
And then it grows. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but that's true. Yeah. So that's kind of, to me, I'm like, that's why I do this. So I reach just a few people deeply enough, and that's what it's about.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time, but I you've listened to the podcast, I ask this question a lot. If you, knowing what you know now and where you are in your career and how you've gotten here now, looking back, is there anything any advice you would give to your younger self to do anything differently?
Well, as far as doing anything differently, I think we can't really do that, because we have to stumble and fall and kind of learn things. I think you learn things more by making a mistake or making a wrong turn. You have to do that to internalize it. So even if I told myself something, I probably would have ignored it and done the same thing. So I don't know how helpful that would be in like stopping me from, making a not great decision. But I do think that as we, get a little more mature, we have, I think, a greater sense of just having a confidence in yourself and what you uniquely can provide, and being persistent. I was just never giving up.
Yeah.
Not that you shouldn't change direction. Don't be like pig-headed about something like, oh, I said I was going to be this kind of lawyer, and gosh darn it, I'm going to be that kind of lawyer, even if I hate it. But no, not that kind of thing. You got to adjust based on information you get. But if there's something that you want to do and that you think you could, be of great service in doing it, then you should just do it. And I think the biggest lesson from the podcast and the books for me is just kind of follow your intuition, follow your heart, follow what you think is going to do good in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that's good, great advice. And I agree, like you have to stumble and fall a little bit to make progress. I mean, there's, it's like you don't learn, you learn more from mistakes than you do from, successes.
Yeah. And I try that too, like with my law students, with my associates, I always try to like avoid them. I don't want to see them. You could stumble in some way, but like, don't do it this way, because this is a way I can tell you, like, avoid that, Yeah. And it doesn't always work. Like they still do that. And you just realize like, yeah, you can try to help, but maybe you're not really helping. Maybe they do have to go headlong into that and learn for themselves, even if you, strenuously recommend that they take a different path. Nope, they have to do it for themselves.
Yeah. And I mean, even like, and think of all the things that you've done, and they weren't easy, and you had to make some mistakes along the way, like launching your podcast, doing the publishing company, like the book, you keep doing things that are challenging yourself, that there's going to be little failures along the way, and you just have to kind of push through them, and you learn, and you learn from them and you know how to, how to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, how I got into appellate work was working on a US Supreme Court brief when I was in my 20s, like my very first appellate brief that I worked on my own. And, that's when I decided I really like this because I think I have an instinct for how to do this, but, that brief might be very different now, several years later, but just having that, sort of eagerness to grow and stretch yourself is important.
Yeah. Well, MC, it was such a pleasure having you on. I think you and I could probably dig in a lot about talking about podcast stuff, but I don't want to bore all our listeners with the nitty gritty details about our shows. But, for everyone listening, can you let them know how to find your podcast and how to find your book? And so they can get those notes to put in their kids' lunches and inspirational quotes from your mom, and where they can tune into your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So the podcast is the Portia Project, and it's available on really every platform, but also it has its own website, which also has video and transcript summaries. So PortiaProjectPodcast.com. And the books and related merchandise are on mothersthoughtsfortheday.com. And then I'm on LinkedIn as well, and also my law firm, website, buckhalter.com.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and share with all the listeners out there. So thank you so much. And, for our listeners, if you like what you hear, as always, please like and subscribe to The Defense Never Rests. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, and we also are on YouTube at TDNR Podcast.